Today, we have a one-on-one interview with Dacre Stoker, and I'm your host, Gail C. Martin. We're going to talk to Dacre about the Dracula legend and how it moves forward into the future. But first, I'd love to let Dacre introduce himself, please.
Thanks, Gail. Yes, my name is Dacre Stoker. I am the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, author of Dracula. I live here in Aiken, South Carolina, a transplanted Canadian, and my wife and I do a heck of a lot of research. And actually, this Dracula has dominated the last 15 years of our life, as I have sort of taken the mantle essentially for the family in the creative process, but also in the research as well. And I do actually represent Bram's great-grandsons who are still living, and they are the direct descendants. I'm an indirect descendant of Bram, and I help actually doing some trademark and licensing of Bram Stoker's intellectual property with what is left. Most of it's in public domain. So we try to, wave the Bram Stoker banner, let people know his side of the story. Obviously, he's long gone and didn't leave us many things to remember him by. And Gail, I've sort of taken that role on, is to sort of let people know, who Bram Stoker was, more than just that fellow, that Irishman who wrote Dracula.
Well, that's a perfect place to start, which is, when did you really become aware of your connection to a legend that everybody's heard of?
Well, I could be cheeky, and my normal answer is like right out of the womb. When I came flying out, that doctor had the cross in his hand, and he's like, watch out. But no, in reality, it was more like 12, 13, 14 years old, somewhere there. Growing up in Montreal, Canada, and Halloween was big in Canada like it is down here, and it was like all these friends would come to the door and go, "Ooh, what's going to happen to the Stokers? Are you going to give us candy or take our blood?" And I was like, "Dad, what are they talking about?" And he finally, kind of explained to me, what little he knew about his great uncle Bram Stoker. Obviously, we knew his younger brother very well because he was our great-grandfather. This was George Stoker, who was a very interesting guy in his own right. He actually invented ozone therapy, if you can believe it. But he wasn't the horror writer, so he didn't get quite the accolades, through history as Uncle Bram. So that was sort of like early 70s, and then I went off to boarding school and then college, and I then luckily picked up a book by McNally and Florescu, these two Boston College professors who wrote In Search of Dracula. And that was the book that I guess made me the family expert, because I've read the one book that was out there that connected Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes, to Bram Stoker's Dracula in the novel. And it's because those guys lucked out big time, Gail. They went to the Rosenbach Museum looking for a woodcut of Vlad the Impaler. And at that time, the curator said, "Oh, you're interested in this Vlad Dracula? We've got something really interesting here we're really not too sure about." And they pulled out these boxes of Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula.
Oh, wow.
And these were the notes that somehow the provenance is sketchy. Bram Stoker's widow, Florence, sold a lot of Bram's library in 1914, 2 years after Bram died. She sold it off to make room for things, but also to bring in some necessary cash. And somehow this 125 pages of research notes, which, Gail, is a gold mine for Dracula fans and researchers alike, and they made their way to Philadelphia after a number of stops. And that's what these guys did their research on. And that made me aware of what people knew. And then, of course, I kind of caught the bug and slowly over the years read some more biographies as they became available. But it really wasn't until early 2000s that I, got into it in a serious way, when Ian Holt asked me to help him turn a screenplay he had, and let's write this into a novel and include Bram Stoker in the story. And that's when I got serious. That went from the naive young schoolboy to, if I'm going to represent the family, if I'm going to be involved in writing a book, I darn well better know as much as I can. So that meant reading all the biographies, going to conferences, going to these archives, libraries, and figuring out what the world knows about Bram. And in the short version of 15 years of that, Gail, is there was no autobiography. There's a few biographies that most of them get some of it right. Not all of them get all of it right, but taking bits and pieces, because Bram just didn't leave us much. there's so much left to question about what his inspirations and his motivations were. And yes, we know what went into the writing. Yes, we know some of the books he found in the London Library, where he did it, what inspired him in Whitby, but not some of the other cool stuff about what kind of a person was he. And that's what really has kept me going, is figuring out what wired this guy. What kind of a person was he? Was there things in his life that sort of caused him to, have this dark sense of imagination, and so on and so forth. So that's what really keeps me going, and that's where it all started.
Wow, that's a terrific story. Now, what have you discovered about Bram himself? Because of course, unless somebody left a lot of journals or had somebody write an autobiography in their, while they were still alive, well, wrote an autobiography or had someone write a biography, it was hard to leave a lot behind aside from letters and notes. How are you piecing this together, and what have you found?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. It is doing things like when we find, and I subscribe to a lot of these auctions. When I see a letter, Bram Stoker, it's up for auction, I immediately take a screenshot of it and I read it, because I can't afford to buy them all. I bought a few, but when I find those letters, who's he writing to? What's the nature of that story? And that kind of becomes a piece of the puzzle. And I've collected, multiple pieces of these puzzles. Some of them even, Gail, are inscriptions in books that go up for auction. He may have inscribed in someone's book, to Gail Martin, my good friend from so and so. Oh, now how did he ever meet Gail Martin? What's going on in his life? Why would he have inscribed to Gail Martin? And that's a piece of the puzzle. So the thing about Bram that really jumped out at me originally, and most people still find very, very interesting and amazing, is that, first of all, he was very lucky to live. He was a very ill young child. First 7 years of his life, he was essentially an invalid, but nobody knows really what caused the illness. There was no family records. Now, we do have understanding from the remaining members of the family that there was a lot of asthma and respiratory allergies in the family. There was Bright's disease in the family that caused some to go prematurely blind. So there was some genetic stuff, but there's speculation about other illnesses, but none of them could have done the normal or caused the normal residual effects like rheumatic fever, other things that were fairly common, because Bram Stoker grew to be a strapping, healthy young man, and at the age of 16, 17, 18, became a champion all-around athlete at Trinity College. So it's not like he was a shriveled up little guy, and as a result of something and his body was scarred by this illness, he bust out of it. And from what I know, having been an athletic coach and a teacher, and there's asthma still in our family, people do bounce back from asthma, even without, in those days, they didn't have puffers and inhalers and albuterol. They got bloodlet. And Bram had a famous uncle who was a famous bloodletter. And I've read his treatise. And I'm convinced that young Bram most likely was bloodlet because of the fevers and things he went through. So as a result of this childhood illness, even though they bloodlet him, probably repeatedly, he survived. And I think that's probably one of the things that caused him to develop a fairly deep dark sense of imagination. And the other little piece that adds this puzzle is, while he was sickly, to keep him entertained, not only did his nanny read him Irish folklore stories that are pretty gruesome in itself when you really look into them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the leprechaun from Lucky Charms. It's the fairies and banshees and all these life-sucking creatures, much like vampires. But I found documented evidence that Bram's mother told him a story of her own exploits, surviving a horrifying cholera epidemic in 1832 when she was 14. And that epidemic was, of course, as I said, cholera, but nobody knew what was causing the cholera. They thought it was airborne. They didn't know it was, from the water or touching the fluids from the people who were affected by it. And the Thornley family had to try to escape their town, tried to get to a safe town, were met by soldiers with fixed bayonets, took all their belongings, burned them in a fire. They escaped. And she told the story that also included premature burial after people being misdiagnosed. And so I just have to think as I look into this wiring of this young boy, and as sickly as he was, and if it was asthma, and you know how hard it is to suck down a breath if you're having an asthma attack, thinking maybe that he was misdiagnosed or would be and buried prematurely. And he suffered nightmares, which comes out in his writing. So that's what I guess to try to come to a conclusion of this second question of yours, which I could drag on forever. Bram lived through a lot of strange things that he used in his books, which is not unlike many writers, horror writers, you know, and other writers. So he experienced things that when he started writing about them and combined them with his really diligent research, made them seem much more realistic. And that's where obviously Dracula resonates still today as a book that is horrifying, as do some of his other stories. They were all sort of written in present day, in real time, and made to feel realistically horrifying. So that's my one big takeaway of Bram.
Okay. How did he go from a boy growing up in Ireland to the connection to an Eastern European count?
Yeah.
What made him make that connection to Vlad the Impaler?
Okay, so imagine this, because that's a great question. First of all, while he was in Ireland and a student at Trinity College and recovered from his illness, big stud on campus, he also had to work because his dad retired early from Dublin Castle as a civil servant. So his father, Bram, was number 3 of 7 kids. His oldest brother, famous doctor, he's actually the medical advisor for Dracula. His sister was an artist. Bram was number 3, and they said, Bram, we got a job for you. We've opened up a place in the petty session legal department as a clerk. So here is this guy, a strapping young man, athlete, you know, coming into his own when it comes to writing, loving drama. And then he gets squished into the, you know, the basement of Dublin Castle to be a clerk in the lowest level of legal stuff. But in typical fashion, Bram actually did a really good job of it and became promoted to the inspector of petty sessions. So in typical fashion, this analytical side of him ended up writing a legal manual, if you can believe it, that was used in all of the court systems in Ireland up until 1960. Mind you, while he was doing that, I'm sure the other side of his brain, that creative side, the writer's side, was being starved to death. So his remedy was writing theatrical reviews. He loved the theater. And on one of those nights, he went to a theater and watched Henry Irving play Hamlet and wrote a glowing review. And Henry Irving, being the egotistical actor that he was, saw the review the next day and said, I need to meet this young man. And so Bram was summoned to meet Irving. They had this wonderful dinner and drinks all night. And long story short, Gail, she thought he was amazing. He thought Bram was amazing and said, I've just purchased the Lyceum Theater. I want you to come and help me manage it. So there's the dream come to Bram. He moves him from Dublin, a fairly oppressive and conservative society. His artistic side can flourish, but that analytical side can help balance the books and run the theater. But it's there that Henry Irving flourished in the role of Mephistopheles, this devil's assistant. And this begins to answer your question. Where are all the connections between Bram and this vampire count? And it begins, I am convinced, with watching Irving play the role of the devil, because this is also the time when the occult is prevalent in society. Seance, Bram was friends with Conan Doyle. He was good friends with Pamela Colman Smith, who was the lady who illustrated the first tarot card. So he was right in the mix of the intelligentsia of people, but also this kind of secret society that were looking at the dark and black side, the occult side of the world. That, I think, got the juices flowing. But then, now that we've got these actual records, because just 2 years ago, all of Bram's 28 books that he did his research in the London Library for Dracula have been discovered. And he even went so far as wrote notes in the margins. So they contacted me and another scholar and said, we'd like you to come over and help verify this. And at first, Gail, it was a little embarrassing because here's my great granduncle, famous guy, but he's scribbled in their books. But when we deciphered all the scribbling, there's certain notes that direct us to realize what Bram found very interesting and important in those books. And it had to do with the occult, the supernatural, trance walking, symbolism, vampirism, mesmerism. So it was all these things that were not just the dark side of Victorian society. These books, one was written by a priest, one was written by a well-respected doctor, 4 adventurers who had gone off to Transylvania and cataloged the people, the places, they've drawn maps about Transylvania. So here again was Bram, again, using his imagination, but making this story and this connection to Count Dracula real, because he found in these books Vlad Dracula, the Prince of Wallachia. And he simply, borrowed some of the history, the name, some of the things he did. He moved him from Wallachia next door to Transylvania. He found a castle in the book and he merged it with a castle from Scotland. So it was Bram's perfect way of creating this willful suspension of disbelief by mixing his imagination with the real world research that he found in the library.
That's a fascinating tale and an awful lot of detective work going into it.
It's fun detective work. I mean, I joke, and when J.D. Barker and I wrote Dracula, we called ourselves literary forensic detectives, because what keeps this going, obviously, everything I'm mentioning to you is not just done on Google. It involves flying somewhere and a lot of expense. So it certainly helps to take all this cool stuff and mix it all together and use it for my own work. And with either Ian Holt or J.D. Barker or Leverett Butts or now recently Chris McCauley, we take all this cool research, lay it out and say, okay, let's use this for a story. Number one, it makes a great story in the same fashion that Bram did, but it also helps pay for all the research work and the next discovery.
Yes, that's very much how it works, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Now, as you've gained a greater understanding of Bram, how do you imagine him when you think of him? We all have these kind of imaginary relationships sometimes with our literary mentors. Do you picture him in any particular way, as if from the unique way you've gotten to know him?
Yeah, I got to tell you, with all the interviews I've done in 15 years, nobody has ever asked that. And I'm so glad you have, because I do believe I understand him well now. I was one of the folks that helped bring his lost journal to life. And Elizabeth Miller, who is one of the best scholars in the world when it comes to Bram and Dracula, I found it. My Bram's great grandsons, my cousins, had it, one in their attic. And as I was reading through it, it was not fictional. It was Bram's way of looking at the world over an 11-year period. While he was a student, while he worked in Dublin Castle, some of his ups and his downs, but while he was trying to become a writer, much like myself. I wasn't trained as a writer. I wasn't a writer through college. I was a scientist. I was a physical educator. I was an outdoor educator. And moving into writing was something that came late. And it did for Bram as well. But I feel in a way that he's a very interesting and introspective type person that never had the opportunity. Either he didn't choose to or just didn't have the opportunity to beat his own drum, because he had something to prove to the world and to his father. I mentioned his love for the theater. His father warned him when Bram made an initial move to writing a theater play with the famous American actor called Genevieve Ward. And I've seen the letter, and it's basically, your father slapping you in the back of the hand. And he said, the theater's no place for you. It's wonderful for entertainment. You've got a good job. You're lucky you have this job. This is low life, which theater was at the time. But I believe inside Bram, even though his brothers were three famous doctors, his sisters were artists, one other brother a civil servant, Bram had something to prove, that the artistic side of life, his writing, his own drawing and sketching, and his ability to manage a theater, and importantly, elevate the role of the theater in British society, was something that Bram was on a mission to, as was Irving. And as a result, Irving was the first actor ever knighted. So, and not only that, but the upper crust came to the plays and watched the plays at the Lyceum Theater, and that opened the doors to other theaters, making sure that actors and actresses not only knew their lines and wore proper costumes and had historical sets to be on, but they weren't drunken fools outside of the theater. This was what I mean by the whole role of the theater. And Bram was on that mission and didn't take much time to worry about himself or shed light on himself. Even his writing, I think, was one of those things, except for Dracula, that got worldwide acclaim. Some of his other stories got somewhat of acclaim, but nobody has taken the time to really, as I've been trying to do, understand this guy and, sort of shake his hand or pat him on the back or say, you know what, you're right. This is an interesting way of looking at what you're telling us, rather than, oh, Dracula's a really cool book. Who's the next guy that's going to turn this into a movie? It's never been done the way Bram Stoker wrote it. But that's the next couple of steps. But getting into Bram said, I have to say, I am working with Chris McCauley to try to make, to me, the penultimate documentary on Bram Stoker. And it's not just Dracula centric. Obviously, to catch the attention of producers, you need to have Dracula, but this is my mission. And I feel he's here, at times when I'm writing, I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, what do I say next? As I'm writing notes for anything I write. And I almost feel like he's channeling it. I'm not trying to be hoity-toity or weird, but I just feel it's there because I put so much into it and I understand him, I think, very well.
That's fascinating. And that perfect setup for what I wanted to ask next, which is, every author has a voice, and certainly there's a very strong voice. I've read Brahms' novel many times. It has its own very strong voice. You've taken the story further. When you're writing extensions in the Dracula world, how do you mingle his voice and yours?
Boy, that's a good one too, because we've got to realize that readership these days is different than readerships in 1897. And the language has changed somewhat. People are not willing to sort of fight their way through difficult dialects. Storytelling needs to be easier. I hate to use the term dummying down, but I've heard that thrown around, by agents who say, I can remember when they told JD, now, hey, you've got to write your story for, 10th grade people, 10th grade high school students. And it's like, no, we're not going to do that. It needs to be for people slightly more intelligent than that. But it's, people don't want to read books unless they're in a classroom that they're going to have to really fight their way through. So what I try to do is still write in the way, that challenging way Bram Stoker did, to put you on the edge, put you in the center of some horror, but soften it in a way that it's easy to go into and come out of, rather than maybe make it hard to navigate your way through. Otherwise, I think they'll just close the book because this is too difficult, or I'll go get the Monarch notes or something or wait for the movie to come out. I want people to ease their way through, to get caught up in the sense of the words and the sense of the flow of the story, and not realize that they just spent 2 hours reading a really cool story, and when they think only half an hour maybe went by.
Yeah, Victorian storytelling had a very specific style, and it's very different from what readers expect these days, or are, unless they're literature majors, really trained to parse through and know what they're seeing. So yeah, for recreational reading, absolutely.
Yeah.
So which of the characters in the original Dracula do you think Bram identified with the most? And how is that different from maybe who you identify with?
You know, I've always thought that Jonathan Harker, Bram channeled himself through Harker a lot. That's what I believe, and I'll tell you why. Bram was called to the bar. Back in the days, you didn't go to law school. You were called to the bar because your peers respected you and figured you'd be a good lawyer, and then you'd go study and take a test. Well, he was called to the bar, but he chose not to go. But he certainly had a legal mind, and he used that well. I've seen some of the contracts that he wrote for his own book, so I can see he would have made a good lawyer. He also made sure that he negotiated all of his own his own contracts. So there is that legal Jonathan Harker side, but he was also a bit of an adventurer. Bram, as I mentioned earlier, became the inspector of petty sessions. That meant he drove by carriage or train all over Ireland, checking on all the clerks of the petty sessions legal department. He traveled with Henry Irving to America 8 times. He was in charge of all the train schedules for the whole Lyceum Theater troupe. He went to the continent of Europe a few times. And my research has shown he only went as far east as Italy to actually bury his father. So he never made it to Transylvania. But I feel there's that sort of quiet hero of Jonathan Harker, that he was a confident young man that went off into the world a little bit brazen, heading off to Transylvania, thinking that, England is the center of the world, and whatever I do, I'm going to be okay because I'm English after all. And he realized obviously that didn't work, and so bad things happened. And I think Bram experienced a lot of that himself, traveling to America, getting to know people that, it's not always, you can't just be, some strong, just because the sun never sets on the British Empire, you're not the be all and end all. So that guy, I think, is Bram. And in a way, he did the same thing with Mina, with his mother and his sisters. So Bram took qualities of the modern woman, and his mother was certainly that. She was a very serious activist when it came to women's rights, to rights of people who, in those days, they call them the deaf and the dumb. She got up and read a paper about how they should be educated, how women should be treated better in workhouses and so on. And she did that in societies that were all male. So she was a tough one. And Mina is a bit like that, as is Bram's sister Matilda. But then his brother, I think, is an awful lot like Dr. Seward, both a physical doctor as well as a doctor dealing with people with psychological issues. So he took a lot of his own family and inserted them at different levels into these actors and gave them their voices, in these characters, excuse me. And when I come to do this, I try to kind of sit back and go, well, I want to represent all the family. I want to try to figure out, was there a little bit of Tom or Richard, or in my case, my great-grandfather, George Stoker, who was a medical maverick, who was a good friend of Bram's. They lived together for a while he was in med school. So I'd say my voice is not singular, Gail. It's when I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to sort of give all the Stoker family their fair share of a voice when it comes to stories. And I'm trying to actually include some of the others in the stories that I think are interesting. Some of the fictional things that bring another sibling into it. Like when JD and I did Dracula, Matilda Stoker, is Matilda, Bram's eldest sister. And I've got letters between them, and we were able to, really characterize her as a real person.
That's fascinating. And I love the insight it gives into how some of those characters came about. Now, you mentioned that Bram never went further east than Italy, which kind of raises the question, certainly back in that day, and even to an extent now, Romania is a bit obscure. It's not on, the top of all of the tourism lists for places everybody's been. A little harder to get to. Certainly harder back then. How did he do his research, and how much was kind of a myth about the country as much as the mythology of the vampire?
Well, it needs to be said that his original um, country that he was setting the story, the story that was set in Transylvania, he was actually going to set that in a portion of Austria called Styria, which is a province. That shows up in his notes in the Rosenbach Museum, very early in the notes. And many people believe, even though the names Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and Carmilla are not written in his notes, he was an Irishman. His story, Carmilla, predated Dracula. He was the editor of the newspaper that Bram wrote his theatrical reviews for. I figured that Bram must have been influenced slightly. And the reason why is if Bram read a story that was a very good story and had got great reviews, that a vampire story was set in Styria, I think Bram would have thought, now I can, people already believe that. I can get them to believe my story is also set here. But he goes off to Whitby on a holiday, and his wife and son join him. It's going to be a 3-week holiday. He goes for the first week on his own. And I'm sure it's kind of like I do when I go to a retreat. I've got to write. I can't have the wife, the dogs, and everybody around. I've got to have just focus. Bram went for a week on his own, and he fell in love with this cool town that's got a real Gothic vibe to it still to this day. But he walked in the library and picked up a book by William Wilkinson. And it's very cool that the library still have records of what books Bram Stoker picked up.
Yeah.
And in his notes, he actually mentioned the book by Wilkinson that actually mentioned Vlad Dracula from Wallachia. And then, typical researcher, I go and buy a copy of the book off of A Books, and I read the whole thing. And there's lots of information about Transylvania, Wallachia, Moldavia. That opens up the door to Bram to sort of look, now we can go here. But it's when I believe he looked those other 28 books I mentioned in the London Library, that Wilkinson book is also there, but there's another book by a guy called James Samuelson that does one more cool thing. It connects the name Vlad Dracula with being an impaler and the devil. So the Wilkinson book said, Dracula means dragon or devil. The Samuelson book also means devil. So he's got two sources that point to devil. And then he's got Henry Irving playing the devil. And I believe, Gail, in that summer of Whitby, the beginning of 1890, when he started writing his novel, those three things came together. He's looking for a home for the devil. He finds his devil in Dracula, and other elements of those books. As I mentioned, there was at least 4 other adventurers. Charles Bonner, Andrew Cross, Elizabeth Machiavelli, Major Johnson have all written travel logs of their experiences going to, just as you said, this country a little bit beyond, the norm. The sort of the Western world kind of ended in Budapest, as far as, some people are concerned. But beyond that was this interesting country. As the book says, Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard, the Scottish lady who wrote a book by that name. And she included all these cool superstitions. And that book was also in the London Library, and Bram had marked it up. So that's what I think was sort of this coming together, as I always use this sort of an analogy of putting puzzles together as I do. I think Bram did the same. And when he found that this was an area of volcanic activity, it was an area of superstition, it was an area of that the devil's playground in this volcanic area, and he found the perfect historical character to sort of base his Count Dracula after. Then the rest is just up to writing the story.
Now, you have, I believe, visited Romania and the castle that is said to be Dracula's. How did that inform your thinking about the story, or maybe future stories?
Well, the last question you said, not many people sort of have gone there because it is too far. And you're absolutely right. It's a bit of a pain in the butt. You've got to fly to Paris or Amsterdam and take another 2-hour flight to Bucharest, or to the top of the country up to Sibiu. So nowadays it's not bad, but it is, 9 to 10 hours of flying, a better part of a day. But it's really worth it when you get there. They've got really cool history. They've got, people just, love North Americans. Food is great, and it's inexpensive. I've now been there 12 times. I lead tours there now. I started going to do research with a friend of mine, Hans de Roos, who was on all kinds of cool research digs, so to speak, not archaeological, but looking for castles and stuff. And I'll just say this to sort of keep this part down a little bit, because I was actually hired by Airbnb in 2016 to host Night at Dracula's Castle, which was very cool. But I had to tell them Bran Castle, which markets itself as Dracula's Castle, has a very light connection to Bram Stoker's Count Dracula and Vlad Dracula himself. And I say light, here's the two pieces. Number one, Vlad did have a presence on the border of Wallachia and Transylvania. And there's a very good chance that he stopped in there for a while. There's rumors that he may have been held captive there for a couple of days. His great-grandfather or grandfather, one of the two, actually was the custodian for a while. So Vlad's technical connection to Bran Castle, minor. Bram's story does not occur anywhere near this place. The Borgo Pass and everywhere else that Jonathan Harker had his adventures in are 400 miles to the northeast. And Bram knew that because, as I said, two of these books had maps in them, very accurate maps. And we've seen in his notes, Hans de Roos actually spent a couple of years on this, finding the lines of longitude and latitude that Bram scribbled in a notebook.
Oh, wow.
They coincide, once inverted, to the Borgo Pass and a volcanic mountain in the northeastern part of the country. So I've been to Bran Castle, and I had to explain to the folks when I was hired by Airbnb, I'll go with you, I'll go along with you. We'll have a night at Dracula's Castle, but I also want to explain to the press the rest of the story, as I just did to you and your listeners. But now, Gail, I've actually been to just a year and a half ago and started working on a documentary taking people to the actual location near the Borgo Pass in the Kalamanalui National Park, which is an extinct volcano, the exact place where Bram had that massive battle between the band of heroes and the gypsies protecting Count Dracula in his carriage before he can get back to his fictional castle up on top of this mountain. Now, no spoiler, but there is no castle there. It's the location Bram was looking for, but all points in that story, when you look at Jonathan Harker coming across the train to Klausenberg, to Bistritza, the carriage drive to Borgo Pass, it's all there at the end of the story, the train ride, the steamship ride, the carriages converging, all the names of the towns. You could tell that Bram was looking at his maps, describing things exactly as they were. And I can say proudly, I have now been there with the permission of the National Park. I put up a plaque there saying this is the location of Bram Stoker's story and his fictional castle Dracula, and that a documentary is in the works. Once we get back to normal travel schedules, we'll be able to finish that off.
That is a fantastic adventure tale. Now, let me toss you an easier question, perhaps, and that is, there have been so many Dracula movies and adaptations and retellings. Aside from the original and your own, do you have a favorite of all the treatments out there?
You know, it's an easy question, but it's not, because number one, I want to be respectful for people in the industry and say, look, I get it. Art is in the eye of the beholder. Movie making, writing books, poetry, sketching, eye of the beholder. So a lot of very interesting and period specific movies have been made about Dracula. I personally like the 1977 BBC miniseries with Louis Jourdan. And I like it not because it's a great artistic work, because it's faithful to the book. And I like it for that reason. But I have to say, I also love the 1992 Coppola version. I think the artistry, I think Jim Hart, who has become a friend and we do presentations together, he talks about his adaptation of Dracula to the screenplay, and I talk about how Bram wrote the story. But he used some very cool folklore himself, as did Bram. He used folklore to create how did Vlad the Impaler become a vampire. And then along comes Luke Evans at Dracula Untold, a whole movie about how Vlad the Impaler became a vampire. So it's sort of cool. And I like all different pieces of all of those. There's not one that stands out like crazy. I even like the Claes Bang BBC Netflix version that Moffat and Gaddis wrote. You know, it's strange, it's out there. The first two episodes were incredible. A great reimagining for the third episode. I give it to them. That's cool. And you know, I'm with it. I'm ready though for somebody to actually film Dracula in the period way as Bram Stoker wrote it. That's one thing that would probably need to be done in about a 10 or 12 part miniseries. I'm still waiting for that though, Gail.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, what are you working on now, and where does Dracula go from here?
Well, first of all, Chris McCauley, a good buddy of mine, we've started the Stoker McCauley. You can find us on Facebook. We started something called the Stoker Verse, because we're expanding. I figured that, you know, enough years have gone by when the Stoker family has not been involved in graphic novels, games, documentaries, all that kind of stuff. Lots of other people have done their versions of it. So with Chris McCauley, we've got our first graphic novel out called The Virgin's Embrace that can be purchased at Amazon, Book Depository, Barnes and Nobles. It's one of Bram Stoker's most horrifying short stories. I believe it's semi-autobiographical. And it's my first foray into taking a story and adapting it into a graphic novel. The graphic novel published by Andrews UK actually has the full text as Bram wrote it. The story was called The Squaw. We adapted it into a more aptly named The Virgin's Embrace after the torture device in the Nuremberg castle. And that's number one. Number two, we've got a audio book out with some Doctor Who actors who are reading scripts that are extracted from Dracula, but Chris and I go in slightly different directions. You know, a little bit about what was Renfield's actual background. You know, how did Jonathan Harker and Mina get together? How did Mina and Lucy become friends? So what I've done is created this sort of roadmap with Dracula and done two big things with them. And this is what we're exploiting in games, the graphic novels, and documentary. And that is, what were the parts that were in the Dracula notes that Bram couldn't include in the story? What were the parts actually in the typescript of Dracula that the Paul Allen estate, that's the Microsoft co-founder estate, owns, that were taken out? And I've seen it with my own eyes and know what was taken out, what was inserted at the last moment. So what we're trying to do is bring back Dracula as Bram Stoker originally envisioned it, adding some of our own stories to that universe, but also let people see, what did Bram Stoker originally envision? And let's get back to that original Dracula, with all due respect to Gary Oldman and Claes Bang and the others. Let's get that, you know, that monster, let's get him back into play rather than the romantic guy that has shown up since then.
Well, that sounds really exciting. Do you have something coming out in the near future, something on the horizon, or just a lot of things in progress right now?
Well, as I said, just about 3 weeks ago, The Virgin's Embrace came out. Voices of Dracula is coming out right now on Audible books. I think you can also get them through Andrews UK. We've got something called Dracula's Bedlam, which is the story of, again, we've expanded the story of what was going on in Dr. Seward's asylum. That's a book that's come out. We've written that with John Peel, who is a Doctor Who writer. That should be out within a month. And then this documentary, we have got the script written, and we're just sort of working on that. What else? There's a VR game in the works. I can't give you too much more detail than that. And there's also one of these interactive books that's in the works with Tin Man Games. So all of these things, you know, take time, but they're all greenlit and moving forward, which is really kind of cool.
That's tremendously exciting for all of us, you know, vampire enthusiasts out there. Well, Dacre, this has been so much fun, and the time has flown. You've mentioned a couple things about online sites, but can you please tell everybody again where they can find you online?
Yes, so the probably the best place at the moment is Facebook Stoker Macaulay Facebook page. We keep everybody up to date there. We also have in the works, so it's in the works, a stokerverse.com website. You can go see it now, but it won't be totally complete. Dacrestoker.com has things about my tours to different parts of the world, Romania being one of them, Ireland and Scotland and Whitby being others. That's also where my book information is, and also follow me on Facebook as well. So those are probably the best places to find me. And then, as these conventions start opening up, I'm thrilled to death. Going to be at Monsterama in October. Going to be in Michigan at Paracon in end of August. So more and more of those are happening, and I'm just thrilled to get out and start meeting with fans and telling these stories. And I really appreciate, Gail, your time to chat with me. The questions were great, and you sort of pulled out some of the best of what's in the Stoker verse. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us, and thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There will be more authors, more books, and more vampires here on ConTinual. So we'll see you online.